Next, I'll be meeting with David Ainsworth, who's the head of communication for the CBD. The CBD, I think it's part of UN. I'm going to ask him, this is where we are. The COP is part of CBD. David, he's taking care of the communications for the UN, essentially for COP15 as a whole. He's extremely busy. So I'm very fortunate to have a moment with him. And yeah, I think you'll appreciate his, he's an amazing communicator, as you would imagine.
So I'm Dave Ainsworth. I'm the head of communications at the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so I'm the one who runs media matters over here, coordinates the social media work, a lot of video production, photography, everything that we use to try to communicate what we're doing here.
So this is a full-time job.
Definitely.
It's not just for the COP15.
Yeah, so when I'm not doing biodiversity COPs, I'm doing this at the time because the Secretariat provides communication support to the parties all 365 days a year. So the parties are constantly implementing the program of work for this. The parties are, always trying to move forward on getting stuff moving forward.
Yeah, even when there's not a COP going on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, see, with the COP is we make all the decisions here and sort of set out the program of work. But in the in-between periods, governments are implementing it. Different organizations are also involved.
And you're still taking part in that.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. The work of the Secretariat is to support the governments, not just in the negotiations, but anything they do to implement the convention.
I see. And where are you based?
We're based here in Montreal. In fact, we're only a couple of hundred meters from the Palais des Congrès, where we're holding the meeting right now.
Okay, so that's probably a big part of the reason why you decided to do this one here, since it was a bit last minute. And
well, actually, no, the decision to move forward here wasn't taken by we, the Secretariat, it was the government. So the government said, listen, we understand that the government of China has got, difficulties in bringing these people from all over the world to their country due to their COVID protocols. Let's find another solution. And they looked, and then the government of Canada stepped up and said, you know what? We host the Secretariat, and then we know that, we're the ones who should do this, and so we're ready to step forward. And so they're the ones who agreed to, essentially pay for all of the work that we're doing here.
Right. So tell me, what do you love about this job?
Oh my gosh, well, when I was a kid, I dreamed of working for the United Nations. I really thought it was a good opportunity, and I kind of lost track of it for a while, but I think it's great for me to be working with people from around the world, to be exposed to all these different cultures. It's a great chance for me to help live out and apply the goals of the UN. The goals of the UN are about human rights, they're about peace, they're about creating a safe and secure environment for everybody. And I get the chance to do this, so it's really an honor.
So let's talk about this COP specifically. Where are we? Because they've been working on this agreement for years, as I understand it, 4 years, I believe, right?
Yeah. So back in 2018 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, they had the 14th meeting, so COP14. And that's when the government said, "Okay, listen, we've been doing work for decades. We know that we need a new plan. We figured out what we've done before. We figured out a little bit of some of the lessons learned. Let's create a new plan." And so they started those negotiations. They meant to have this all done actually by 2020, but then we know that the pandemic intervened. And that slowed down the negotiations. It slowed down all of our ability to do all these sort of things. So that's why we've been at it for 4 years. But governments have been, they've worked on the documents. They met in person before the pandemic. Then they had all these online meetings. It was quite something, people connecting from all over the world. And then this year they went, super high speed forward. They did a meeting in Geneva where they worked on issues. Then they had a meeting in Nairobi. They worked on issues. And then a smaller group got together in Montreal in September to hammer out a few things. And then they came here just a few days before this COP started and discussed it again. And now we are here in the final stages of working on this agreement.
Wow. So who, when you say they, I understand it's the countries, the parties, as you call them. Why isn't it called the countries? Because there's more than just the countries. There's also NGOs and...
Yeah, it's kind of a standard legal thing where when you talk about a party to the convention, it's someone who signed on. Someone said, I agree to be a part of it. But we don't say countries also because we've got not just countries, we also have the European Union. That's one of the parties of the convention. And so in addition to all the individual states in Europe, we've also got this regional, super regional body. So that's one of the reasons we call them parties. Governments are the ones who decide who's on their delegations. But generally the people who work with the Convention of Biodiversity are mostly from ministries of environment, sometimes ministries of natural resources, and sometimes from broader ministries. But generally they're people who've already been dealing with environmental questions. And so the people who join these delegations are mostly from those ministries, but for big level negotiations like that, the government delegates might also include representatives from foreign affairs. Or other ones as well, because it's an international treaty. So frequently for many countries, they really have to have that expertise there. But I mean, one thing I'm just going to mention is that if our wishes come true, we will in the future have more than just ministers of environment or environment people involved here. What we'll do then is we'll actually have people from other ministries, so infrastructure, economy, that sort of stuff coming on these meetings too.
Right, and then I noticed there's faith-based organizations.
Right, okay.
There's, I know that, I understand that is new as well. It's more understandable why we would see NGOs, environmental organizations taking part. But it seems like you're really trying to include every part of society.
Yeah, so for these UN negotiations, right, the governments are the ones who do the negotiating, but they take, advice or information also from a whole variety of different stakeholders. So we get, NGOs that represent civil society who participate. We have people who represent indigenous peoples and local communities, known as IPLCs under a process. They also provide advice. We've got representatives of women's groups, representatives of youth.
They're providing.
Yeah, they do, because they don't specifically negotiate. What they do is they may, in some cases, make suggestions to governments of text that could go in, things that could be done. And if the governments agree, they pick up on that and bring it in. But it's everybody. We want to bring everybody into the tent. In fact, at this meeting, we have got more representatives from business and finance than ever before. And then you mentioned faith-based organizations. We have a lot now. You can find representatives from faiths across the world that are really engaged in this process.
Yeah, I found that very interesting because it's about inner change. Having this faith-based, the spirituality element added to it, I thought made a lot of sense, because we need to change ourselves before we can change the world in a way. So yeah, I love that. You just mentioned business and finance. Now, I know there's some talk about the idea that they shouldn't be here because they're part of the problem, essentially. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Maybe put some minds at ease why we would want to involve?
Well, so I mean, we know now as we do our diagnosis of what's going on, and under the agreement, we've got to conserve biodiversity, we've got to use it sustainably, and we've got to share the benefits with equity. And so we do know now that the system of production and consumption that we've configured in the world is the problem. That we subsidize the destruction of forests, we subsidize overfishing, and we've got a lot of business practices that just aren't sustainable. The argument of making sure that business is here is to say, how can we engage business in a dialogue that allows them to recraft their policies? So what is what we call the business case for biodiversity? And not turning to business to say, like, you got to be good to the planet because it just makes you good corporate citizens. It's to point out to them that, we now have the figures that show that it makes business sense for you to be sustainable. The World Economic Forum put all these things that pointed out that, business practices now, by causing biodiversity loss, actually are a fundamental risk to what businesses are doing. There's a big group called Business for Nature here that's looking at, actually calling for some mandatory guidelines, some mandatory practices that need to be brought in to business as well. So, I guess it's a question about, do you want to have a dialogue where everyone's involved, or do you want to have a dialogue where some people aren't at the table? And the businesses here are the people who are willing to listen and to make that step forward.
And are they specific businesses, or are there more consortiums?
Well, it's both. I mean, we've got individual businesses, but they're generally organized under these bigger consortiums. So Act for Nature, Business for Nature, that sort of thing as well. But it's both individuals, but then they're trying to work together in terms of a common voice. But that's how things work overall in this process. Is you've got groups that come together that represent both individual voices, but they also express common positions.
You're really giving me a great understanding. Where are we at this point? Let's talk about the different rooms. I understand there's different negotiations and different negotiation rooms.
So right now we're on the top floor of the Palais des Congrès, and the top floor here, as you can see, there's some areas where delegates are relaxing, they're talking, they're probably discussing papers, following up on email. But the biggest thing we've got up here is there's the big plenary room. So that's the room where, when we opened the meeting on the 6th, everyone was there for the ceremonial opening. On the 7th, when we started business, we were there. And today in the plenary, they've got one of the working groups taking place. Because the way this thing works is that we start always in plenary. Plenary is where all the governments, all the representatives assemble.
Plenary is like for planning, plenary, right?
Well, it's plenary, Plenary, plenary.
What does that mean?
It means the main stage, or the main area. Okay. That's where the countries come to an agreement and say, right, this is how we move forward. When they start the meeting, it's where they discuss how they're going to advance on the agenda, and when they close the meeting, it's where they approve all the final documents. Now, it's not practical to have everybody together for 2 weeks in this room. We wouldn't get enough work done. So what they do is they've decided, okay, once the plenary goes, we agree to divide the agenda into sort of 2 halves, and we work on it in parallel. And those are called the working groups. So we have working group 1 and working group 2. They take the agenda, and the agenda deals with a whole variety of subject matters. So it deals with this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It deals with other questions too. It might deal with marine biodiversity, invasive alien species, and all those sort of things. And then they break it up. And so they look at these items more closely. Now, if it turns out that they have sort of a disagreement, like they've got issues that they want to further cover, well, what they do is they take those working groups and they break them down further, and they create either contact groups, is one word, or friends of the chair. These are smaller negotiating groups where they say, you know what, we've really got to get into the text and have quite an intense dialogue. They do it in smaller groups so that they can really engage in the negotiations, the consensus building, and that sort of matter. And so we've got rooms here for those. Those are rooms that only the people involved in negotiations are in, so you and I and the other representatives of the media can't come in. So this is an example.
Pacific.
Yeah, so this is interesting. This is another. The Asian Pacific room is a room devoted where all the countries from that region can come in and have their meetings. Because as I said, remember, it's like voices come together as groups or as individuals. So the countries in that region, they coordinate their positions. They talk about, where they've got points in common, that they can advance common positions, where there are differences, that sort of thing. And each region has one of these rooms. So they've got one, the Latin America region has another one, Central and Eastern European region has another one, Africa has one, Western Europe and others have also, they've all got these spaces as well. So those are the things where they do their coordination. And it's interesting because, regions want to express a common position, but none of them necessarily want to say like, right, our position is going to be, a single position for the whole region. There are always important differences.
Yeah, it must be difficult for continents like Asia to come together on common agreements.
It's not unique to any single region. They all, in some cases, have got good common points, but all of them have got a challenge in terms of, ensuring that it works. But that's what they do. I mean, that's what this process is about. It's about dialogue, where you acknowledge what you can do in common. Where you've got divergences, you find a way to still come to consensus so that people represent their own positions, but come together to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction.
And all of this is about coming to a consensus on an agreement to basically make some changes in everyone's own countries. In this case, to reach 30 by 30.
Well, that's
all about that agreement.
Yeah. What's one part of it? So at the conference the parties meeting, in general, it's like we're coming up with decisions that will help countries live up to the objectives of the Convention of Biological Diversity. The Convention of Biological Diversity is where countries have agreed to do 3 things. First, they agreed that they're going to conserve biodiversity, make sure it doesn't get lost. Second, they're going to make sure that it's used sustainably, so that when we're doing all of this economic activities or anything, we're doing it in a way so that we're not removing the possibility for future generations to enjoy this. And thirdly, we agree that when we're doing this, any of those benefits we get from using the genetic resources of our planet are shared equitably. That's the broad thing. So all the discussions that are being done here in Montreal are about specific subjects that deal with that. So it's like, what do we do in the forest ecosystems of the planet to make sure we live up to that? What do we do in the marine and coastal ecosystems? How do we make sure that we can control invasive alien species so we don't have those issues as well? Now, what makes this specific conference unique is that there's supposed to be a big framework, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, where governments are going to agree to a certain set of goals, certain set of targets that will help guide them together as they move forward over the next 10 years. Now that's the big thing. It's taking up most of the agenda, and that's where governments are going to agree on these targets. You talk about 30 by 30, that's one of the possibilities there. They've got to agree on these targets at a global level, but then after that, figure out how they will implement it at the national level as well. So, but it includes things like, 30 by 30, protecting areas. It includes finance. It includes dealing with subsidies. It includes dealing with pollution. Pollution meaning, nitrogen and phosphorus and pesticides and even plastic pollution, that sort of thing. But a whole series of 20, at this point, we're up to 23 targets under discussion.
And how is it going?
It's pretty slow. I mean, it's
We're on
interesting.
how many days now?
Well, today is the third day of the actual COP itself. We'll be going on for, I think, about another 11 days now. It's interesting. If you talked to me yesterday, I would have said, oh my goodness, this is not going fast enough. But there's some significant progress made on this particular big framework over the last day. We'll see. But it's a lot of work because they've got this whole suite of targets that they've got to really come up with a specific language for each one so that they can look at the 3 or 4 or 6 sentences that describe the target and agree on it, and then also agree on the framework to implement it down the line.
And that's a negotiation, is the word.
Yes, exactly. In fact, just negotiate. So right, we're coming up here now. You'll see in a minute. We'll walk around here. We'll take you. So this is one of the working groups is meeting right now. So the working group in this case, they've gone over some elements where they've already got consensus and they're talking about it, and then they're still identifying where they don't have consensus and moving forward on it. So I'll have to speak quietly, but let's come. We can take a look in here. But come on in. So here's where you see all the different delegates. So this is working group number 1, and they're covering certain issues now. Right now, they're covering the issue of what's called Article 8J, that deals with traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. They've already got mostly a consensus on this document, and that's why they're moving forward in this. So you see, these are all the governments in the front of the room. So if the governments are on the front of the room there, and in the back are the different observer organizations that are taking a look. And so they're the ones who might provide some advice. But the advice the observer organizations provide, it's only taken up if the governments agree. So an NGO might say, this is what we need to do, but it only takes up if the government says, I agree and I sponsor that. So these governments are all these people in the front rows here.
Now, there's observers, of course, but media is allowed in this room.
Yeah, media can come into this room and you can follow the proceedings. It's streamed online.
Okay.
They can quote it, they can take pictures of it. This is public work because at this point in time the governments have finished the real negotiations. Here, we'll step out now.
Right.
And that's it. So this is where anybody can come in. It's open to the world to look at.
Because technically we're right. I mean, they've gone through all of the kind of private conversations they need to have in order to come to a consensus among themselves and then come together in this room. There's another room like this.
Yeah, there's another one. Working Group 2 is located, on the lower floor. We'll go in and they're doing the same thing there. So what they'll do here is, where it's come to consensus, they'll talk about it. But also in these groups too, they'll identify where they need more discussions and they'll agree who gets to go to these contact groups or these Friends of the Chair meetings.
Now it seems obvious now that you've explained it to me, but can you tell me why media isn't allowed in some of these meeting rooms?
Well, with some of these negotiation areas, what's going on is there are positions that are sort of proposed as possible options or outcomes, right? So a government make an expression of something they want to do, but it's not their final position. And with representatives who are not involved in the negotiations, there can be misunderstandings in that case. It's the same way that if you were doing a business negotiation, you wouldn't invite the media in to do contractual negotiations with anyone else. What you would do is you would report on how it's going after it was all finished. So that's kind of the principle for it as well, and it allows the governments to have frank exchanges and not feel that they have to control or manage the spin of their messages. They've only got to speak to each other in that case. So that's it. But I mean, of course, the media is free to try to find these delegates afterwards and talk with them and see what's on the go.
But at the same time, you don't want to disturb the process by bringing a camera in or bringing an outside party that doesn't belong there.
Yes, exactly. That's very much so, because these people are focused very much on their discussions as well. So I'm not going to speak too loud for this next space, but just letting you know, there's another room over here where we've got something called Place Québec.
Yeah.
And Place Québec it's funded by the government of Quebec in its entirety. And Place Québec is a space where we're looking at what's called the action agenda, which is where governments have said, all right, we need to figure out how different non-state actors or people around the world are going to step forward and help us implement this agenda. And so in this space, all different organizations are having events. So here's a business and finance event that's taking place here as well right now. They're having a discussion. The United Nations has got a platform, faith-based organizations. But these are all these discussions where they're showing how they can possibly become involved in implementing this convention down the line. Exchange of ideas, new things put forward, all that kind of stuff.
And it's not fluff. I mean,
No, these are pretty serious. When people give a presentation here, they're really talking about very specific, concrete, and practical ways that different actors are going to be involved in implementing the convention. So yeah, it's not fluff. If people come here with ideas that aren't very well founded, then there's a frank exchange to make sure that they improve. That's the whole idea.
Right. Okay, here we see these different.
Yeah, so different organizations here in this case. So we've got the IPLCs, Indigenous Peoples Local Communities,
and
women.
These are where those kinds of advisors are based.
Well, I mean, if in this case, this is where those kind of groups that offer advice are exploring their ideas, presenting new proposals, talking about how they can come forward, but also to network. Because remember, we're bringing these thousands of people together who don't see each other very often, and this is their chance where they can get together, share ideas, coordinate, figure out how they're going to work, and move forward over the next couple of years. Maybe we'll keep going around this way.
So, David, if I'm starting to understand your job correctly, you're kind of like a, what do you call it, like a traffic?
Well, now, I don't know if you mean me specifically or the Secretariat. I mean, me specifically, my job is to do what we're doing right now, is for me to talk to people and explain the process, and hopefully in a way that they understand. The Secretariat in general, I'm there in the Secretariat. I've got colleagues who are scientists, lawyers, economists, all these other experts, and their job is indeed to find out what the parties want to do, in some cases help guide them to bring ideas together and assist them in moving this agreement forward. So the Secretariat is people who are like, right, once you, the governments, have decided which way you want to go, then we help you do it and make it move forward. So, my job is to help communicate all of it, but my other colleagues would help them actually move forward and technically implement other parts of this agreement.
Right, and I mean, I don't know how you can see clearly through everything that needs to be communicated here. Everyone wants to have a voice, and at the same time, that's what I mean by the traffic.
Right.
You're managing this traffic of information that's coming out of here. I don't know. How many years have you been doing this?
I started this work in 2003. So I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, and it's a lot, yeah. So, but I mean, as far as it's a lot of different voices that we have, a lot of different voices, but the point is that I think you can give a space to many voices and many people. That's the whole point, is to find multiple spaces where people can express themselves, give them both individual and collective things to do, and find a way to show everybody that this is a conversation we all need to have together. It's always a trick, individual voices and ideas, but showing where they all come together. I think there was some metaphors that were used in the opening speeches about, a chorus, about voices that are both, soloists, but also harmony that we're looking at working on together.
Right, that is a great metaphor for it. One final thing, and it's kind of a big question in a way. I just figure you've been at this for 20 years. Could you give me an idea of the story of COP? How we've come to this point here, from your personal perspective, because you're a storyteller. You're really by communicating all this, you're getting a sense of that story and you're helping tell it. So how would you tell the bigger story?
So I think, the story of the convention is the story of how back in 1992, coming out of that Earth Summit in Rio, the world had this idea that we could move together, we could come up with a framework and rules and guidelines so that we could begin to develop a sustainable relationship on this planet, a relationship with each other, a relationship with the ecosystems, and do it. And so the story of the convention is beginning with that dream, then figuring out how to do it in a way that would allow us to be very effective. The first steps were about understanding the science, figuring out how you would divide up the different questions to make it move forward. And then after that, it came to the question of, well, if we know the science, how do we implement it? And so years were spent figuring out, what does that mean, a program of work on forest biodiversity, or what does a program of work on drylands biodiversity mean? How do we work on that? And then governments figuring out that, right, we have these programs, but who's got to be involved? How do we bring this story and make it larger? Because it first started out as a conversation with people who cared about the environment, but then they realized that, this conversation needs to be about people who are not environmentalists. It's about people who do a lot of other things, And so it's realizing that the discussion and conversation includes us all. But it's also a conversation where, as we're coming to realize what we need to do, there's an urgency going forward, because whether we're talking about the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis or the pollution crisis, realizing that, right, the weight of our actions on the planet are huge, and so that this work we're doing to redress that, to build a sustainable relationship, has to happen fast. I mean, the vision of the convention is that by the middle of the century, by 2050, we will be living in harmony with nature. And that's the vision of it. And so the story is, how are we moving forward to build that life in harmony with nature?
I was thinking about the 30 by 30, and it occurred to me, well, if we can hit that goal, even if we're close to it, then it would make sense to go 40 by 40 to finally come to 50 by 50.
The protected areas, I mean, it's a really important question. So one of the ways to protect the biodiversity of our planet is indeed to create protected areas. And so, you know, the idea that we don't protect enough of the planet is indeed the case. But we have to make sure that when we're doing that, are we doing it in a way that lives up to our other goals? So, you know, we have, 8 billion people on the planet now? I think we crossed the line fairly recently. So as we do this stuff with nature, how do we also make sure that we are, providing for the well-being of those 8 billion people? So you protect half of the planet, but if you do so, what about the people who already, need to live in those lands, and they need to rely on the forest, the timber, the wildlife in there? How do you ensure that we're protecting it, but also making sure that they can continue their livelihoods? And in some cases, a lot of those people are some of the best custodians. So it's not only about how much of the planet we're protecting, it's like, how do we protect it? How do we involve people in the protection? But then also, what do we do outside of that? So you protect the planet, but we now know that what you do outside of these protected areas has a huge impact on it as well. So you set up a protected area, but if you've devastated everything around the rest of it, you're not going to have the right impact. So we have to do it all. So that's part of it. It's not me saying that 30 by 30 is not the overall goal. It's an important component of all the many things we need to do.
Wow, David, you really, we've done great, I think. No?
Great, okay, perfect. I'm glad we can help. Well, listen, I'm looking forward to you getting a chance to talk to other people and to share with people what's going on at the conference. My hope is that this is just the beginning of a sort of a new awakening or conversation that everybody has. I've seen all the articles here in the Montreal Press, and people are beginning to get a sense now of what this means here in Montreal. So it's not just, we international delegates hanging out here. It has an impact on what you do in the things you eat, the things you buy, the way you configure your house, just thinking about your overall relationship with the planet and the life on it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason.